Today, we're going to take a brief look at the Bristol Beaufighter. It began life as a stopgap developed from another existing design, simply meant to fill Britain's desperate shortfall of fighters in the years leading up to the Second World War. It would end up serving both RAF and Coastal Command as a night fighter and later as a strike aircraft, often remembered under the nickname of Whispering Death, a name supposedly attributed to its enemies in the Far East. Ultimately, it would outlast the war, serving on the front lines in various post-war conflicts until the end of the 1940s. The story of the Beaufighter starts at the end of 1938. With another world conflict seeming just to be over the horizon, the British Royal Air Force became acutely aware that it did not possess enough fighters to take on the resurgent German Luftwaffe. This was a concern shared by many individuals within the British aircraft industry, and several designers began working on emergency solutions to this fighter shortfall. Among them, Bristol Aircraft's chief designer, Leslie Fries, the inventor of the Fries aileron, and his assistant, Roy Fadden, launched a private endeavour to adapt the Beaufort torpedo bomber, which had just started flight trials, and turn it into a twin-engine fighter. The Type 156, as it would become known in-house, was never meant to possess record-breaking performance. Rapid design and ease of production was the main focus. The wings, rear fuselage, and the tail of the Beaufort were all taken wholesale, but were now attached to a new, slimmed-down fuselage and equipped with more powerful engines. Owing to its rather precarious situation, the Air Ministry was somewhat taken with the idea of an almost ready-to-go fighter and issued Specification F-17/39 to reflect this new design. Between the largely already designed airframe and the impetus of seemingly looming war, the prototype phase was completed in record time. A substantial production order was placed straight off the drawing board on the 3rd of July 1939, and just a couple of weeks later, on the 17th of July, the prototype would make its maiden flight. Very similar to the Beaufort, the Type 156 was a mid-wing monoplane. The first variant would be powered by a pair of Bristol Hercules radial engines, producing around 1400 horsepower each in early forms, later on rising to over 1500 horsepower in later variants. In clean prototype condition, this gave the aircraft a maximum speed of approximately 335 miles an hour at around 16,800 feet, with service Beaufighters in full operational trim achieving a slightly lower top speed, just over 320. Now, supply issues with these engines would lead to the Mark II variant using the 1280 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin 20, which gave broadly comparable performance and even slightly better speed at higher altitudes. Armament would start with 4 nose-mounted 20mm Hispano cannons, but would soon be expanded to also include 6 .303 caliber machine guns in the wings. This made it one of the most heavily armed fighters in the world at the time of its introduction into RAF service. The Mark I version had a range of roughly 1,400 to 1,500 miles, with a service ceiling of approximately 26,500 feet. Large for a fighter, it had a wingspan of 57 feet 10 inches, a length of 41 feet 4 inches, and a height of 15 feet 10 inches. Empty, it had a weight of around 14,500 pounds, with a maximum takeoff weight of just over 21,000, though these numbers do differ depending on what source material you read. Early prototype testing showed reasonable performance characteristics, although it was notably unstable and hard to control on the yaw axis, an issue that would continue to plague the type throughout its operational career. This was particularly felt during takeoff, with the aircraft tending to swing sharply on the wheels as it left the ground, a handling trait that would catch out more than a few rookie pilots and even some veterans as well. Later versions would experiment with a 12-degree dihedral on the horizontal stabilizer and various other refinements to the tail services in an attempt to alleviate the issue, to some success, but it was a problem that was never completely resolved. As with many heavy fighters of the period, particularly the early models, the Beaufighter could not compete with single-engine aircraft in a dogfight, but its size and power quickly found it other uses. Perhaps the most well-known were the Beaufighters assigned to the Fighter Interception Unit, which was tasked with tackling the Luftwaffe's shift to nighttime raids. Early airborne interception radar sets were too bulky and heavy for single-engine fighters, but the Beaufighter proved to be perfect for the task. Radar-equipped Beaufighters would start operations in early September 1940, but early teething problems meant that the first confirmed Beaufighter victory on the 25th of October was achieved before the type had really demonstrated the potential of its new equipment. And it would not be until the night of the 19th of November that the airborne radar clearly assisted with a Beaufighter victory. Initial efforts in this field were slow, with only 12 enemy night raiders being shot down in the next 6 months. But as systems and crews improved, and with better coordination with ground controllers, this tally would begin to rise. In a particularly heavy night raid on London on the 19th of May 1941, night fighters would claim 24 kills compared to only 2 aircraft that were brought down by anti-aircraft guns. Another major role that was adopted by the Beaufighter was as a long-range fighter by Coastal Command. These were modified to increase range, and although additional wing tanks were proposed, it proved difficult to incorporate them on the production line. As an expedient, 50-gallon tanks, originally intended for the Vickers Wellingtons, were mounted on the floor of the Beaufighter's fuselage between the cannon bays to provide the extra fuel and range. The coastal versions would receive the designation Mark 1C for coastal, while the night fighter versions would get the letter F. These coastal versions would operate not just around Great Britain, but also in North Africa, the Middle East, and from Malta, beginning to replace the Bristol Blenheim in that theatre. 1941 would also bring about the abortive Mark V variant of the Beaufighter. This was an interesting machine, which was an attempt to take the concept of the Boulton-Paul Defiant turret fighter and inject it with a lot of steroids. The Beaufighter Mark V had the 4-gun turret from the Defiant installed in place of the observer position. To compensate for the weight increase, all wing-mounted machine guns and 2 of the 4 nose-mounted cannons were deleted. Now, in theory, this gave the Beaufighter the ability to attack a bombing formation from its vulnerable underside, much like the Defiant, but with the help of extra engine power and a much more sturdier airframe than the Defiant itself. In practice, though, the Mark V was abandoned after just 2 models were produced. Flight testing showed that its armament configuration was, well, impractical, particularly because the turret obstructed the pilot's escape route in an emergency. If he bailed out at higher speeds, there was a real risk of him bodily colliding with the turret, which could understandably have fatal consequences if he was incapacitated by the impact. Additionally, it was felt that the turret was not worth the loss of forward firepower and airframe performance, owing to the increased drag, and also because it became apparent that such turret fighter attack strategies were not consistently effective, if at all. In its more orthodox configurations, however, the Beaufighter would be consistently effective. It was fast, sturdy, and it packed one hell of a punch. Perhaps one of the more well-known sorties of a Beaufighter took place in 1942 with Operation Squabble, which is, incidentally, the least intimidating name for a combat mission ever devised. This saw a lone Beaufighter flying across the channel at low level to drop the French flag over the tomb of the unknown warrior at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and then go on to strafe a Gestapo headquarters. In 1942, the Hercules radial engines were finally available in sufficient numbers again to power the Mark VI version of the aircraft, bringing an uprated 1,650 horsepower per engine. This gave the options to carry greater offensive armament. Up until now, the Beaufighter had been mostly employing its impressive gun armament against small ships and submarines and soft land targets. However, with the greater engine power, the Beaufighter was reworked into a torpedo-carrying variant that was nicknamed the Torbo. This was followed in 1943 with a rocket-carrying strike version, which was widely known as the Rockbow. They were clearly getting very inventive with nicknames. In the Far East, the Beaufighter would be used extensively as a strike aircraft. Supposedly, it earned the nickname Whispering Death from the Japanese on account of the Hercules engine's peculiar sound in a dive and its low-level approach, though this has sometimes been misreported as Whistling Death in later retellings and in some books. Now, for the name itself, I say supposedly because although numerous texts refer to this nickname, none can be traced back to Japanese sources. And indeed, the earliest use of this nickname that I've been able to trace down was from the British press during the war. It's highly likely, therefore, that the nickname was just a bit of wartime propaganda, but as with many aircraft names, it stuck around. Nevertheless, the Beaufighter was instrumental in the air in the Far East and in the Pacific theatres. It was sturdy, reliable, and it could carry a potent amount of armament. It was particularly adored by the Australians. Australia would produce its own Beaufighters with parts shipped from Bristol's factories, and these would serve in the Royal Australian Air Force. Notably, these exchanged the original 6 .303 caliber machine guns for 4 US-manufactured Browning .50 caliber guns, giving a much heavier punch. In a variety of roles, the Beau, as it was affectionately termed, would serve until the end of the war and beyond. It would be converted into the Beaufighter TT, or target tug, and used to train air gunnery until 1960. It would also continue to serve on the front lines, attacking communist positions in Malaya in 1948 before being replaced with the Bristol Brigand. Post-war, the Beaufighter was sold to numerous other countries, such as Israel, Portugal, Turkey, and the Dominican Republic, where it would see its final combat operations in mid-June 1949, when Dominican-operated Beaufighters attacked Caribbean Legion exiles, attempting a seaborne landing that was being mounted from Guatemala. Unfortunately, I haven't found any good photos of Beaufighters in post-war use, and this has sort of kicked off a side project of me to find out some of the more interesting stories of World War II aircraft that saw service in the opening years of the jet age. With over 5,000 aircraft built in total, and a service life lasting over 2 decades in practice, the Beaufighter was a stopgap aircraft that did far more than it was ever intended to do. It was a solid airframe, simple to build, and it was based on a proven design. The Beaufighter was exactly what the RAF needed at the beginning of the Second World War. Luckily, with so many being produced and being somewhat sturdy, there are still a moderate number of surviving examples preserved at air museums around the world. The usefulness of the Beaufighter can be seen by it receiving an almost direct upgrade. Bristol would be awarded a contract for a new modern aircraft that drew on the Beaufighter experience and some of its design features, and this would give life to the Bristol Brigand. But that, dear viewers, will be a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. Now, some people have expressed concern about my shift to shorter videos. Please be reassured that the longer videos are staying. I'm just, at the moment, trying to strike a balance, A, for my sanity, and B, because the YouTube algorithm really doesn't like it when I have long gaps between uploads, and over the next couple of months, there's a lot of big stuff going on in the background for me, and so these shorter videos are just helping me keep things ticking over, as it were. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members. Now, I'm going to be producing some videos on aeronautical engineering and development topics soon, which is one of the background projects. Research work has been going along steadily, and a couple of scripts are in the drafting stage. I currently have zero idea about the predicted video lengths for these, but they'll probably have a runtime of between 30 and 120 minutes depending on the depth of the topic, so that's hopefully something to look forward to in the not too far distant future. But that is all for now. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.